Urgent, scandalous news about a conversation between Donald Trump, Volodymyr Zelensky and European leaders in Paris on September 4. As you know, on that day in Paris, there was a meeting of the Coalition of the Willing, where security guarantees were discussed. And so Trump got in touch with Zelensky, Macron and several European leaders, and immediately shifted the conversation to criticizing the European Union. He accuses Europe of fueling the war by buying Russian oil, demands pressure on China, and avoids specifics about new sanctions. Trump pressured European leaders to stop buying Russian oil and called for increasing economic pressure on China. That's what Reuters reports. And Axios adds a political angle, writing that in an online meeting with Zelensky and Europeans, Trump said that Europe should take on most of the responsibility for containment. And in the end, three outlets, Bild, Axios and Reuters, are all reporting that Europeans no longer expect Trump to introduce any new sanctions against Russia. My name is Alexei Pichi. Let's discuss this topic, but before we start, let me remind you that on this YouTube channel, fresh news analysis videos are released every day so that you can stay up to date with absolutely all the news. So subscribe to this channel and like this episode. So what exactly was said and how did it sound? What started the scandal and why did Trump criticize the Europeans? According to Axios sources, Trump was straightforward and said that Europe must stop fueling the Russian war and Europe is obliged to put pressure on China. Enough with the double standards. And then Ursula von der Leyen, as Axios writes, tried to counter with numbers and stated that Europe is reducing its share of Russian gas, has imposed oil embargoes, set a price cap on Russian oil, and is generally ready to completely abandon Russian gas by 2027. But the German newspaper Bild notes the mood after this call and writes that the European side no longer expects Trump to impose sanctions against Russia, even though that's exactly what his partners were asking him to do. And one more detail from the German press, the conversation was heated. Trump's special envoy Steve Witkoff accused Europe of being the one buying Russian oil through India. This is an old American complaint from recent months, but today it was brought up directly against the backdrop of the Paris meeting on security guarantees for Ukraine. Well, as you can see, Trump is really hitting a sore spot here. He's pressing on Europe's weak point. Let's be honest, yes, the European Union has almost completely stopped buying oil delivered by sea and has stopped buying Russian coal, but so-called grey blends and re-exports through third countries still remain. In February, Center for Research on Energy and Clean Air analysts noted that even in the third year of the invasion, the European Union still buys significant amounts of Russian oil and gas. In several months, the amounts exceeded the financial aid package. That is, Europeans paid Russia more for gas and oil than they allocated in aid to Ukraine. At the same time, the European Commission itself publicly reported, and here I will quote from their report. The share of Russian gas dropped from 45% to 18%, and by mid-2024 the share of coal fell to 0. Well, and it is in this rift that today's dispute arose. Some point to progress, saying, look, you see, we used to have 45% dependence on Russian gas. Now it's 18%. We don't buy coal at all anymore, and we're also giving up oil. Like, here are the numbers. But the Americans point out that no, you have loopholes and you use them. You keep buying Russian oil, just not directly. Why is Trump putting all the burden on Europe now? And Axios has been drawing the same line for several days in a row. The White House is convinced that some European countries publicly support Donald Trump's initiative. But behind the scenes, they are stalling and raising Kiev's expectations. Today, this has resulted in ultimatum-like statements. Europe must stop buying Russian oil and put pressure on China. But a logical question arises. What about American actions? And where are Donald Trump's tariffs that he promised against China for buying Russian oil? Where are those sanctions? So Trump is threatening to punish the biggest buyers of Russian oil. Yes, he did impose certain tariffs against India, but when it comes to China, his words just hung in the air. There were threats, but nothing concrete. Everyone heard it. Everyone heard how Trump threatened to impose huge tariffs against China for buying Russian oil, but he never actually did it. Actually, Axios wrote back in mid-August that Trump's threat of new oil sanctions is fading because it would hurt prices and allies. During the September 4th conversation between Donald Trump and the Europeans, as Bild reports, the Europeans tried to save the situation, and the Europeans offered to assemble and send a sanctions working group to Washington within 48 hours and quickly agree on a common list of measures. The Europeans said there was no problem. They'd assemble a team in 48 hours, fly to Washington and reach an agreement. We impose these sanctions, you, Donald Trump, impose those. We're all working in sync, coordinated, everything's great. And now German and Austrian media add that Trump demanded that the Europeans not only cut their purchases, but also put pressure on Beijing. In response, Brussels argued, we've already lowered the oil price cap. The hunt for the shadow fleet is underway. Docks and insurance for shady ships are closed. You should join in too. Let's sync the list with secondary schemes. Here we run into politics again, because when it comes to China, Washington itself is balancing between threats and market realities. So demanding from the European Union, like, do this instead of us, it sounds nice, but it doesn't work well. And it looks like Trump imposed tariffs against India, subtitles created by. He avoids confronting China, asking Europeans to attack China while he targets India, seeing China as a rival and India as more of a partner. And it's unlikely that they'll respond harshly. It's a clever move. Where is the truth here? About the fact that Europe is funding the war. Well, today Trump, in a conversation with the Europeans, says, you are funding the war by buying Russian oil. The honest answer is in the middle, yes. Grey routes through India, mixing these blends, re-exporting, all of this exists and it needs to be acknowledged. What do you mean by grey routes through India? Maybe someone missed that. The thing is, in reality, India buys Russian oil at a discount, then, roughly speaking, relabels it and sends the same oil to Europe, but at a slightly different price. Europe doesn't buy oil directly from Russia, but instead from India, which is still Russian oil. But it's also true to say that the main volume of Russian oil purchases in the European Union is held by Hungary and Slovakia. And these are exactly the countries that are the loudest critics of tough sanctions. And in politics, these two countries are friends with Trump. This contradiction was carefully highlighted today by Axios. Quote, the main direct buyers in the European Union are Hungary and Slovakia. So if you go by the facts, the addresses are known. The only question is whether the White House is willing to put pressure on its friends. What does this mean for Kyiv? First, the idea that Washington will do everything is collapsing. The notion that Trump's threats matter is also crumbling. And as Bild writes today, after talking with Trump, Europeans no longer expect Donald Trump to impose any sanctions against Russia. The European package must move faster, with a $47.5 price cap on Russian oil. Insurance filters, documents, shadow fleet, and strictly shutting down re-export schemes. It's really time to stop playing this ambiguous game. Secondly, the window of opportunity in Paris remains open. Macron said 26 countries are ready to help by land, sea and air to support a ceasefire and ensure peace in Ukraine. This is a summary of his briefing after the Coalition of the Willing, which was quoted by many media outlets today. Against this backdrop, Trump's call is essentially a test. If the United States gets involved, great. If not, Europe must continue to develop its structure without any pauses. This raises the question, what should Europe do now? Given that Trump clearly won't impose new sanctions on Russia, well, first synchronize the European blacklist of tankers and insurers with the British and Canadian lists to close the loopholes that intermediaries from Britain and Canada are still using to trade with Europe. Second, complete the investigation into that very oil blend and impose real bans on entry into European ports for ships caught re-exporting so-called Russian blends. That's what India is doing. I explained a bit above what that is. Third, don't wait for Washington on China, but strike where the European Union has leverage. Insurance, fleet leasing, repair facilities, banking transactions, and so on. So, it's good when sanctions are synchronized with Washington, but when Trump is sitting in Washington and isn't planning to impose them, waiting for eternal synchronization is a foolish decision. And fourth, clearly explain to your citizens that this isn't just some kind of economic skirmish. This isn't a matter of cheap gas, it's a way to cut off the oxygen to the Russian war machine in order to speed up a truce, at least a truce. So today's call isn't just about Trump yelling at the Europeans, as many are trying to portray it now. It's a litmus test. The question isn't who shouted louder, but who brought concrete leverage to the table. And Europe brought them from the coalition of the willing to new oil sanctions. Yes, Europe has its own flaws too, and the United States is now at a crossroads between pressure and political tactics. For Ukraine, the moral is simple: trust these promises less, like ending the war in 24 hours, and focus more on equipment, mechanics, sanctions, and a powerful strengthening of the armed forces of Ukraine. That's just how it is. What can you do? Let these statements stay as statements. It's better to judge actions. That's it. This scandalous conversation between Trump and the Europeans showed Trump isn't planning to act anymore and is shifting responsibility to others. Although, I'll say it again, the Europeans aren't saints in this situation either. Friends, I'll put an ellipsis here. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments under this episode. Subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like. That's it for now. Take care. Goodbye, everyone.